The auctioneer's hammer struck the podium 3 times, and the grand bidding hall of London fell into an obedient silence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting warm light over rows of polished mahogany chairs. Every chair was occupied. Lords in tailcoats and powdered cravats sat with their gloved hands resting on ivory-topped canes. Ladies in layered silk gowns whispered behind painted fans. The air smelled of beeswax candles, old wood, and the particular kind of perfume that only old money could afford. Today's auction was the sale of the Hargrove country estate. 300 acres of fertile Kent farmland, a limestone manor house, and a stable block worth more than most families earned in a decade. Every ambitious landowner in the south of England had come to bid. Adelaide Vance had come for something else entirely. She stood near the back wall, half hidden behind a marble column. Her dress was simple, a dark gray muslin gown with long sleeves and a high collar, the kind of dress a governess might wear to church. Her brown hair was pinned tightly beneath a modest bonnet. She carried no fan, no parasol, no reticule embroidered with her initials. She looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building, and in many ways she had. Adelaide had no money. She had no title. She had no invitation to this auction. What she had was a younger brother who owed £11,000 to a criminal money-lending syndicate, a family carriage workshop 3 weeks away from being seized, and a plan so desperate that even she wasn't entirely sure it would work. She had come to propose marriage to a man she had never met. The auctioneer adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "Lot 14, he announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "The Hargrove estate. We shall begin the bidding at £6,000. Hands rose. Numbers climbed. Adelaide ignored all of it. Her eyes were fixed on the 3rd row from the front, left side, aisle seat. Duke Christopher Sterling sat with his legs crossed and his arms folded across his chest. He wore a black coat, black waistcoat, black cravat, as though he had dressed for a funeral rather than an auction. His dark hair was cut short, almost military, and a thin scar ran from his left temple down to the edge of his jaw. He had not raised his hand once. He had not spoken to a single person. The 2 chairs on either side of him were empty, as if the crowd had deliberately left a gap around him the way water parts around a stone. Adelaide had heard the stories. Everyone in England had heard the stories. The Duke of Stirling had fought in 3 naval campaigns before the age of 25. He had returned from the last one with a medal pinned to his chest and something broken behind his eyes. Since then, he had shut himself inside his seaside manor, dismissed most of his staff, and refused every invitation, every visitor, every attempt at polite society. The newspapers called him the Iron Duke. The servants who had worked for him called him something worse. He was the most feared man in the room, and Adelaide was about to walk up to him and ask him to marry her. She pressed her back against the column and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She squeezed them into fists and counted to 5. Then she stepped out from behind the column and walked straight down the center aisle. Heads turned. A woman in the 4th row lowered her fan and stared. The auctioneer faltered mid-sentence. Adelaide kept walking, her worn leather boots clicking against the stone floor, until she reached the 3rd row and stopped directly beside the Duke's chair. Christopher Sterling looked up. His eyes were gray, the flat, cold gray of harbor water in winter. They moved over her face without any expression at all, as though she were a piece of furniture someone had placed in his path. "Your Grace?" Adelaide said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this in the mirror of her boarding house for 3 nights running, whispering the words to her own reflection until they stopped trembling. "My name is Adelaide Vance. My father was Captain Lewis Vance of the 32nd Regiment, field surgeon. He served at the siege of Corunna." Something shifted behind those gray eyes. A flicker, a shadow. It passed so quickly that Adelaide almost missed it. "I have a proposition for you," she continued, keeping her voice low enough that the nearest row could hear only fragments. "My family is in financial distress. My brother has incurred debts that will see our estate and workshop seized within the month. I have no patron, no dowry, and no remaining connections of influence." She paused. The auctioneer had stopped speaking entirely. The hall was beginning to murmur. "I am proposing a marriage of convenience," Adelaide said. "In exchange for your legal protection and the settlement of my family's obligations, I will offer you the full management of my father's carriage workshop and the harbor freight contracts attached to it. I will also serve as the administrative keeper of your household, which I understand has been without proper oversight for some time." The murmur became a ripple. Someone in the fifth row let out a short, disbelieving laugh. A woman near the window pressed her gloved hand to her mouth. Adelaide felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the hall, pressing down on her shoulders like stones. Christopher Sterling had not moved. He had not blinked. He sat perfectly still, his arms still folded, his scarred face unreadable. Then he leaned forward. Adelaide's heart slammed against her ribs. She braced herself for refusal, for ridicule, for the cold, cutting dismissal that the Iron Duke was famous for. Christopher Sterling looked at her face, studied it, the way a man studies a portrait he has seen before but cannot quite place. His gaze moved from her eyes to the set of her jaw, to the slight cleft in her chin, to the small mole just below her left ear. He was searching for something, and then his expression changed. It was small, barely visible. The hard line of his mouth softened by a fraction. Something old and heavy moved behind his eyes, like a door that had been locked for years, creaking open just enough to let in a sliver of light. "Your father's debt is paid," he said. 5 words, spoken quietly, almost gently, in a voice roughened by years of silence. The hall erupted. Adelaide stood frozen in the aisle, her practiced composure cracking for the first time. She had prepared herself for every possible answer. Yes, no, get out of my sight. She had rehearsed her counter-arguments, her appeals, her dignified retreat. She had never prepared for this. Christopher Sterling rose from his chair. He was tall, taller than she had expected, and when he stood, the people nearest to him instinctively leaned away. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, withdrew a small leather card case, and held out a single calling card between 2 fingers. "Sterling Manor," he said. "Surrey Coast. Present yourself on Thursday. Bring your brother." He turned and walked towards the side exit, without looking back. Adelaide stood in the center of the grand bidding hall, holding a dead man's calling card, while 300 of London's wealthiest citizens stared at her in absolute silence. She had no idea what had just happened. She only knew that it had worked. The carriage ride from London to the Surrey coast took the better part of 2 days. Adelaide and Julian traveled in a hired coach with cracked leather seats and a draft that whistled through the doorframe every time the wheels hit a rut. Julian slept for most of the journey, his head tipped against the window, his mouth slightly open. Adelaide did not sleep at all. She spent the hours watching the English countryside roll past, green hedgerows giving way to chalky downs, then to the gray-blue shimmer of the sea on the horizon. She turned Christopher Sterling's calling card over and over between her fingers until the edges went soft. The card was plain, no crest, no title, no embossed family motto, just a name and an address, printed in simple black ink. For a man who owned half the harbors on the southern coast, it was strangely modest. They arrived at Sterling Manor late on Thursday afternoon. The estate sat on a high bluff overlooking the English Channel, surrounded by a low stone wall covered in salt-bleached lichen. The house itself was large, but neglected, a Georgian limestone block with tall windows, most of which had their curtains drawn. The gravel drive was overgrown with dandelion and couch grass. A single stable boy waited at the gate, and he looked barely old enough to shave. "Cheerful place," Julian muttered, climbing out of the coach and stretching his arms above his head. He was 24, fair-haired, with the kind of easy handsomeness that made people trust him too quickly. It was that same easy charm that had led him into a card game in a Cheapside back room 6 months ago, where he had signed away £11,000 he did not have to a man named Malmesbury. Adelaide did not answer him. She was looking at the house. Every window was dark, except one, a faint amber glow on the second floor, far left. Someone was watching them from behind the curtain. The fabric shifted, and the light disappeared. The front door was opened by a woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a knot, and a face that suggested she had never once in her life found anything amusing. She introduced herself as Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, and led them through a dim entrance hall lined with maritime paintings and unlit wall sconces. The house smelled of salt air and cold stone. Half the rooms they passed had their doors closed. Dust cloths covered the furniture in the main parlor, like white ghosts, frozen in mid-conversation. "His Grace will receive you in the study after supper," Mrs. Calloway said, without turning around. "Your rooms are in the east wing. The bell pull connects to the kitchen. Supper is at 7. Do not wander the west corridor after dark." Julian raised his eyebrows at Adelaide. She shook her head slightly. Not now. Their rooms were clean but sparse. Whitewashed walls, narrow beds with plain linen, a washstand with a chipped basin. Adelaide's window overlooked the cliffs and the gray channel beyond. She stood there for a long time, watching the waves break against the rocks below, and tried to understand what kind of man would live like this by choice. Supper was served in a small dining room at the back of the house. Cold roast chicken, bread, butter, and a dish of boiled potatoes. No wine, no candelabra, no footman standing at the sideboard. Mrs. Calloway brought the food herself and left without a word. Christopher Sterling did not join them. At 8:30, Adelaide was summoned to the study. The room was warmer than the rest of the house. A fire burned low in the grate, and the walls were lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, most of them filled with naval charts, shipping ledgers, and bound volumes of harbor law. Christopher sat behind a wide oak desk, a single oil lamp casting deep shadows across his face. He was writing something when she entered, and she noticed immediately that his right hand was trembling. The pen shook between his fingers. The ink line on the page wavered and split. He set the pen down carefully, as though hoping she hadn't seen, and folded both hands in his lap beneath the desk. She had seen. "Miss Vance," he said, "sit." Adelaide sat in the chair across from him. The leather was cold. "Your brother's debts have been settled as of this morning," Christopher said. "I sent my solicitor to London on Tuesday. The principal amount, the accrued interest, and the penalties have all been discharged. Your family's estate is no longer under threat of seizure." Adelaide stared at him. "You settled the debt before we even arrived?" "I settled it the day after the auction. That was £11,000. I am aware of the figure." Adelaide opened her mouth, then closed it. She had spent 3 nights in a London boarding house, rehearsing her terms of negotiation, what she would offer, what she would concede, where she would draw her lines. All of it was meaningless now. He had paid the debt before she had even packed her trunk. "Why?" she asked. Christopher looked at her for a long moment. The firelight caught the scar along his temple, turning it from white to gold. "That answer will come in time," he said. "For now, you should know the terms. This will be a marriage in name and law. You will have full authority over the household accounts, the estate staffing, and the harbor freight ledgers. You will be listed as co-signatory on all shipping contracts. In return, I ask only that you do not enter the West Corridor, and that you do not discuss my health with anyone outside this house." His left hand moved beneath the desk. Adelaide heard the faint tap of his fingers striking the wood, an involuntary rhythm, like a pulse he could not control. "Your health," Adelaide repeated carefully. "I have a condition," Christopher said. "It is managed. It does not concern you." He picked up his pen again. His hand was still shaking. He did not look at her. Adelaide watched him struggle with the pen for 3 full seconds before she spoke. "It concerns me now," she said quietly. "We are to be married." Christopher's hand went still. He raised his eyes to hers, and for just a moment, something raw and unguarded passed across his face, surprise, or perhaps something closer to fear. Then the wall came back up, and the Iron Duke returned. "Good night, Miss Vance," he said. Adelaide rose, crossed the room, and paused at the door. She looked back at him, this man who had paid a stranger's debt out of some unknown obligation, who lived in a dark house on a cliff with drawn curtains and a trembling hand, who had taken her desperate gamble and answered it with 5 quiet words in a crowded auction hall. She did not understand him yet, but she intended to. 9 days after her arrival at Stirling Manor, Adelaide hired a local trap and drove herself to Portsmouth Harbour. She had spent the previous week reviewing the household ledgers, or trying to. Christopher had given her access to the estate accounts as promised, and what she found was a mess. Payments recorded twice, invoices missing signatures, supply orders placed for goods that never arrived. Mrs. Calloway ran the house with military discipline, but the financial records had clearly been neglected for years. Christopher either could not manage them or did not care to. What troubled Adelaide more were the shipping accounts. Her father had left behind a small fleet of coastal trading vessels. Nothing grand, just 3 cargo barks that carried wool, timber, and ironwork between Portsmouth and the Channel Islands. After his death, the fleet had been managed by a harbor agent on commission. Adelaide had written to the agent twice since arriving at Stirling Manor. Both letters had gone unanswered, so she went to Portsmouth herself. The harbor was loud and crowded, thick with the smell of tar, saltfish, and coal smoke. Tall-masted ships lined the quays, their rigging creaking in the morning wind. Dockhands rolled barrels across the cobblestones. Customs officers in blue coats moved between the warehouses with clipboards and stern faces. Adelaide pulled her shawl tighter against the sea breeze and made her way up the stone steps to the Guildhall, a squat brick building overlooking the main dock, where all harbor trade was registered and taxed. Inside, the hall was dim and smelled of pipe tobacco. Clerks sat behind a long wooden counter, scratching figures into enormous leather-bound ledgers. Adelaide approached the nearest clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles balanced on the tip of his nose. "I am here to inspect the shipping accounts registered under the Vance Family Trust," she said. 3 vessels, the Callista, the Grey Wren, and the Linnet, all registered out of Portsmouth under Harbor License 14-7. The clerk looked at her over his spectacles. "And you are?" "Adelaide Vance, the trust holder." The clerk turned to a shelf behind him, ran his finger along a row of ledger spines, and pulled one down. He opened it, flipped through several pages, and then stopped. His expression changed, a slight tightening around the mouth, the kind of look a man gets when he has found something he would rather not have found. "One moment, please," he said, and disappeared through a door at the back of the counter. Adelaide waited. The clock on the wall ticked. 2 minutes passed, then 5. She was about to lean over the counter and pull the ledger towards her when the door opened again, and a man stepped through who was decidedly not a clerk. He was tall and broad, dressed in a well-cut bottle-green coat, with a gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat. His hair was dark and oiled back from a wide forehead. His smile was the kind that arrived before anything genuine could follow it. practiced, automatic, and entirely without warmth. "Miss Vance," he said, extending his hand. "What a pleasure. I am Mr. Malmesbury. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in your brother." Adelaide did not take his hand. The name hit her like cold water. Malmesbury, the moneylender, the man Julian had borrowed £11,000 from in that cheapside back room. She had imagined someone rougher, scarred knuckles, a broken nose, the kind of man who operated in alleyways. This man looked like he could walk into any gentleman's club in London and order a brandy without raising a single eyebrow. That made him considerably more dangerous. "Mr. Malmesbury," Adelaide said, keeping her voice level, "I was not expecting to meet you here. I came to inspect my family's shipping accounts." "Of course you did." Malmesbury pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down as though the Guildhall belonged to him. Perhaps in some way it did. "And I came to save you the trouble. Your family's shipping accounts are quite straightforward, Miss Vance. The 3 vessels are accounted for. The harbor fees are current. Everything is perfectly in order. Then why hasn't my harbor agent responded to my letters?" "Because your harbor agent now works for me." Adelaide felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She kept her expression still. Malmesbury reached into his coat and produced a folded document, heavy paper, sealed with red wax. He placed it on the counter between them and tapped it once with his forefinger. "Your brother is a charming young man," Malmesbury said. "Generous spirit, terrible judgment. When he came to me for the loan, he offered the family estate as collateral, standard arrangement. But the estate alone did not cover the full amount, so Julian added a second piece of security." He pushed the document closer to Adelaide. "The deed to your father's carriage workshop, signed, witnessed, and filed with the county registrar." Adelaide picked up the document. Her hands were steady. She unfolded it, read the first 3 lines, and felt something cold settle deep in her stomach. Julian's signature was at the bottom, looping and careless, the way he signed everything, as though consequences were something that happened to other people. "The Duke settled Julian's monetary debt," Malmesbury continued, leaning back in his chair. "Very generous of him. But the deed transfer was a separate contract. It was not included in the discharge. Your workshop, Miss Vance, still belongs to me." Adelaide looked up from the document. "What do you want with a carriage workshop?" Malmesbury smiled again. That same practiced, empty smile. "The workshop sits on a 1/4 acre of harbor-front land with direct access to the freight canal. I have plans for that land, Miss Vance. Commercial plans. The workshop itself is of no interest to me. The ground beneath it is worth considerably more than anything your father ever built on top of it." He stood, adjusted his watch chain, and buttoned his coat. "You have until the end of the month to vacate the premises," he said. "After that, I will have the building cleared and the lot surveyed for redevelopment. Do give my regards to the Duke." He walked out through the front entrance, his boots clicking on the stone floor. Adelaide stood alone in the dim Guildhall, holding her brother's signature on a deed she had never known he'd signed, and understood with terrible clarity that the debt Christopher Sterling had paid was only half the trap Julian had walked them into. Adelaide did not tell Christopher about Malmesbury. She told Julian. She found him in the manor's back garden the following morning, sitting on a stone bench near the cliff edge, tossing pebbles into the wind and watching them disappear over the drop. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who believed his problems were behind him. "You signed over the workshop," Adelaide said. Julian's hand stopped mid-throw. The pebble hung between his fingers. "The deed to father's workshop," Adelaide continued. "You used it as collateral for the loan, a separate contract from the money. Malmesbury still holds it." Julian set the pebble down on the bench beside him. He did not look at her. "I didn't think it would matter," he said quietly. "The loan was supposed to be short, 3 months. I had an investment lined up, A tobacco shipment from the Caribbean. The returns would have covered everything twice over. The ship sank off the coast of Brittany. By the time I found out, the interest had already doubled. You signed away our father's workshop, Julian. The building he spent 15 years constructing. The land our family has held since before either of us was born. I know what I signed. Do you know what Malmesbury wants with it? He wants the harborfront land. The direct access to the freight canal. He has plans for that ground, and none of them involve keeping father's legacy standing. Julian finally looked at her. His face had gone pale beneath his fair hair. Adelaide, I am sorry. I truly am. I thought the Duke's money would clear everything. It cleared the debt. It did not clear the deed. Adelaide sat down beside him on the bench. The wind off the channel was cold against her face. We need to get that document back, Julian. Legally. Which means I need to understand exactly what Malmesbury is doing with that land, and find a way to void the contract. How? I don't know yet, but I need to go back to Portsmouth and look at the harbor registries. If Malmesbury's plans for that land involve anything outside the bounds of his trading license, the deed transfer could be challenged in a maritime court. Julian rubbed his face with both hands. Let me come with you. I owe you that much. Adelaide studied her brother for a long moment. He was careless and impulsive, and had nearly destroyed everything their father had built. He was also the only family she had left. Thursday, she said. We leave at dawn. They departed Stirling Manor early on the 15th day, taking one of Christopher's estate carriages along the old post road that wound south through the chalk hills toward the coast. The road was narrow, flanked on one side by dense hedgerow and on the other by a steep drop to the rocky shoreline below. It was the kind of road that demanded a careful driver and a steady horse, and Adelaide had insisted on driving herself. Julian sat beside her on the box seat, his collar turned up against the wind, his eyes on the gray sea below. They were 3 miles from the cliffs when the wheel came off. There was no warning, no crack, no wobble, no slow loosening. The left front wheel simply separated from the axle, as though the pin had been removed entirely. The carriage lurched violently to one side. The horse screamed and reared. Adelaide grabbed the reins with both hands and pulled hard to the right, dragging the animal away from the cliff edge as the carriage scraped along the road on its bare axle, throwing sparks against the stone. Julian was thrown sideways. He caught the rail of the box seat with one hand and hung there, his boots scraping the road surface. Adelaide locked the brake lever with her knee and hauled the reins back until the horse finally stopped, trembling and blowing foam, 20 yards from where the road curved sharply toward the cliff. "Are you hurt?" Adelaide gasped. Julian pulled himself back onto the seat. His palm was bleeding where the rail had torn the skin. "I'm fine. What happened?" Adelaide climbed down and crouched beside the front axle. The linchpin was gone. Clean gone. No shearing, no fracture, no wear marks on the metal. The pin had been pulled. "This was deliberate," she said. The sound of hooves reached them before she could stand. 3 riders appeared from behind the hedgerow at a canter, rough-looking men on dark horses, wearing long coats and low-brimmed hats. They fanned out across the road in a loose line, blocking the way forward. The lead rider walked his horse closer and looked down at the broken carriage with an expression of mild curiosity, as though he had come across an interesting bird rather than 2 stranded travelers. "Miss Vance," the rider said, "Mr. Malmesbury sends his regards. He suggests you reconsider your visit to the harbor registries." Adelaide straightened up. Her hands were shaking. She put them behind her back. Then came the sound of more hooves. Fast, hard, coming from the north. Christopher Stirling came around the bend at full gallop, flanked by 2 of his groomsmen on heavy bay horses. His black coat flew behind him, and his scarred face was set in an expression Adelaide had never seen before, focused, sharp, and absolutely furious. He pulled his horse to a hard stop between the riders and the broken carriage, and for a single moment the road went silent. "You are on my land," Christopher said. His voice was low and carried the particular kind of authority that comes from years of commanding men in worse situations than this. "Turn your horses and leave before the magistrate's men arrive." The lead rider opened his mouth to respond. Then Christopher's right hand seized. His fingers locked around the reins in a rigid claw, and his arm began to shake, violently, uncontrollably, the tremor running from his wrist to his shoulder. His jaw clenched, his eyes lost focus. The reins slipped from his grip, and his horse sidestepped nervously beneath him. The riders exchanged glances. The lead man smiled. Adelaide moved before the smile could widen. She grabbed the loose harness strap from the broken carriage, ducked under Christopher's horse, and clipped the strap to the bridle of the nearest groomsman's mount, linking the two animals together. Then she pulled Christopher's boot from the stirrup, braced her shoulder against his leg to keep him upright in the saddle, and turned to Julian. "Take the groomsman and ride ahead to the crossroads. There is a coaching inn, a half-mile east. Send word to the magistrate and bring back a cart for the carriage." Julian hesitated for 1 second, then mounted the second groomsman's horse and kicked it forward. The 3 riders, now outnumbered and facing the prospect of a magistrate, turned their horses without a word and vanished back through the hedgerow. Adelaide stood on the empty road, one hand gripping Christopher Sterling's stirrup leather, the other pressed against his trembling arm, holding the most feared duke in England steady in his saddle, while the wind howled off the cliffs and the grey sea churned far below. He looked down at her. His eyes were clearing. The tremor was fading. "You should have told me you were leaving the estate," he said hoarsely. "You should have told me about this," Adelaide replied, her hand still on his arm. He did not pull away. Adelaide began watching. In the 6 days since the roadside attack, she had settled into the rhythms of Sterling Manor with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent her entire adult life managing things that were falling apart. She reorganized the kitchen stores, corrected 3 months of misfiled invoices, and dismissed a grocer in the village who had been charging double for flour. Mrs. Calloway, who had initially treated Adelaide with the guarded suspicion of a woman defending her territory, began leaving the household keys on Adelaide's writing desk each morning without being asked. But Adelaide's real attention was on Christopher. She watched him at breakfast, where he ate little and spoke less. She watched him in the study, where he spent hours reading harbor reports with a magnifying glass because his hands shook too badly to hold the pages steady. She watched him walk the cliff path each evening at dusk, alone, his black coat sharp against the fading sky, his steps careful and measured, like a man counting the ground beneath his feet. And she watched Dr. Hallowell. The physician visited Sterling Manor every 3rd day, arriving in a neat green carriage with brass fittings and a matched pair of chestnuts. He was a small, tidy man in his 50s, with a carefully trimmed beard and the particular kind of smile that doctors wear when they wish to appear reassuring without actually reassuring anyone. He carried a leather medical case with silver clasps, and each visit lasted exactly 45 minutes. He would examine Christopher in the West Corridor study, the room Adelaide had been told not to enter, and leave behind a row of brown glass bottles on the mantelpiece. Christopher drank from those bottles 3 times a day, a spoonful of dark liquid with each meal, measured out by Mrs. Calloway and taken without comment. Adelaide had asked Christopher once what the medicine was for. "Nerve tonic," he had said, "for the tremors. Is it helping?" "Dr. Hallowell assures me it is." Adelaide had left it at that. But she had also noticed something. On the days following Dr. Hallowell's visits, Christopher was worse. His hands shook more violently. His memory, which was already unreliable, became fogged to the point where he would start a sentence and lose the thread of it halfway through. On the 21st night after Adelaide's arrival, she found him standing in the entrance hall at 2 in the morning, holding a candle, staring at a painting on the wall as though he had never seen it before. "Christopher," she had said softly from the top of the stairs. He had turned to look at her. His eyes were glassy and distant. "I cannot remember if this painting was here yesterday," he said. "I have lived in this house for 9 years, and I cannot remember if this painting has always been on this wall." Adelaide had guided him back to his room. She had not gone back to sleep. The following evening, after Christopher retired early, Adelaide went to the study. The brown bottles stood in their usual row on the mantelpiece, 5 of them, each labeled in Dr. Hallowell's precise handwriting: nerve compound, restorative tincture, valerian and bromide solution. She picked up the nearest bottle, uncorked it, and held it beneath her nose. The smell was bitter, earthy, familiar. Adelaide's father had been a military surgeon. She had grown up in a house full of medical texts, anatomy charts, and specimen jars. She had learned to read a pharmacopoeia before she learned to read poetry. She knew the smell of valerian, she knew the smell of bromide, and she knew with absolute certainty that neither of those things smelled like this. She carried the bottle down to the cellar, where the manor's old still-room had been left untouched since the previous housekeeper's departure. The shelves were dusty but intact: copper scales, glass measuring vessels, a rack of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Adelaide lit every candle she could find, poured a small measure of the tonic into a shallow dish, and began testing it against the dried compounds on the shelf. It took her 2 hours. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her, isolating each element by smell, by color, by the way it reacted when mixed with vinegar or heated over a flame. One by one, she identified the ingredients. Valerian root, yes. Potassium bromide, yes. Extract of hops, which would explain the bitterness, and something else. A 4th compound that turned the vinegar solution a pale violet and gave off a faintly sweet, almost floral scent when warmed. Belladonna, nightshade extract. Adelaide set the dish down on the workbench. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her mind was racing. Nightshade in small doses could slow the heart and cloud the mind. In sustained doses over weeks and months, it could destroy a man's memory, disrupt his coordination, and produce the exact symptoms that Christopher Sterling had been suffering from. The tremors, the confusion, the episodes of blankness that left him standing in hallways at 2 in the morning, unable to recognize his own house. Someone was poisoning him, slowly, deliberately, and under the cover of medical care. Adelaide corked the bottle, placed it back on the mantelpiece exactly where she had found it, and went to the household files. She pulled every record of Dr. Hallowell's visits going back 2 years. The physician had begun his appointments 14 months ago. Shortly after Christopher's cousin, Lord Montgomery, had written a letter to the family solicitor expressing concern about Christopher's fitness to manage the Sterling estate. Adelaide found the letter in the correspondence drawer. It was polite, measured, and devastating. Lord Montgomery had suggested that Christopher's war injuries were worsening, that his mental faculties were in decline, and that the family should consider appointing a legal guardian to oversee his financial affairs. The letter named Lord Montgomery himself as the most suitable candidate. 14 months of poison, 14 months of engineered decline, and at the end of it, a signed declaration of incapacity that would hand control of every harbor, every ship, and every acre of Sterling land to a man who had been orchestrating the destruction of his own cousin's mind. Adelaide closed the drawer. She sat alone in the cold study, surrounded by ledgers and letters and the faint smell of nightshade, and understood that the marriage she had entered for survival had placed her inside something far more dangerous than debt. She also understood that she was now the only person who knew. Adelaide did not confront Christopher about the poison. She needed proof first. Something beyond a cellar experiment and a suspicious letter. She needed documentation that could stand before a magistrate, and she needed to understand why Lord Montgomery had chosen this particular method, this particular physician, and this particular moment to begin dismantling his cousin's life. She also needed to understand Christopher Sterling himself, because the more she lived inside his house and managed his affairs and watched him struggle through each day with a dignity that refused to bend, the more one question pressed against the back of her mind like a stone in a shoe. Why had he said yes? A duke, even a reclusive, trembling, half-forgotten duke, did not accept a stranger's marriage proposal in a crowded auction hall without reason. He did not pay £11,000 for a woman he had never met. He did not open his estate to her brother, hand her the household keys, and grant her authority over his shipping contracts out of mere generosity. Christopher Sterling was many things, but he was not careless. Every decision he made, even through the fog of whatever was being done to his mind, carried the weight of deliberate intention. He had recognized her face at the auction. She was certain of it. That flicker behind his gray eyes when she gave her father's name. It was recognition, old and deep, the kind that lives in the body rather than the memory. On the 27th afternoon, Adelaide went looking for answers. The archive tower was at the far end of the west corridor, the corridor she had been told not to enter. It was a narrow stone turret, original to the older part of the house, with a spiral staircase that wound up 3 flights to a circular room beneath the slate roof. The door at the top was locked. Adelaide used the household keys. The room was small and cold, with a single arched window that looked out over the channel. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and every shelf was packed. Maritime charts rolled into leather tubes, bundles of correspondence tied with twine, logbooks from Christopher's naval service stacked in chronological order. A heavy iron safe sat in the corner, its door slightly ajar. Adelaide went to the safe first. Inside, she found 3 items. A medal, the Naval Gold Medal, awarded for distinguished service, its ribbon faded to a dull cream, a folded commission letter bearing the Admiralty seal, and a journal. The journal was small, palm-sized, bound in cracked brown leather with a brass clasp. The cover was stained with something dark, old blood perhaps, or mud that had dried so long ago it had become part of the leather itself. Adelaide opened it carefully, and her breath stopped in her throat. She knew this handwriting. She had grown up reading it, in letters from the front, in margin notes scribbled inside medical textbooks, in the careful labels her father had written on every jar and bottle in his surgery. Captain Louis Vance's handwriting was as familiar to Adelaide as her own face, and here it was, pressed into the yellowed pages of a field journal that had been kept locked in a duke's private safe for 8 years. Adelaide sat down on the cold stone floor, her back against the wall, and began to read. The journal covered 3 months of her father's last campaign, the brutal winter retreat through the northern provinces, where the regiment had been cut off from supply lines and forced to march through frozen passes with dwindling provisions and mounting casualties. Her father had written in short, precise entries, patient counts, amputation records, notes on wound treatment with limited supplies. The tone was steady and clinical, the voice of a man who had trained himself to record suffering without being consumed by it. Then, on a page dated the 14th of February, the entries changed. Received a young officer this morning, pulled from beneath a collapsed gun carriage. Lieutenant C. Sterling, 24 years of age. Severe contusion to the left temple, shrapnel lacerations along the jaw and neck. Unconscious upon arrival, pulse weak and irregular. The field hospital is overwhelmed. I have moved him to my personal tent. and will monitor through the night. Adelaide turned the page. Day 3. Sterling shows signs of consciousness, but cannot speak or focus his eyes. The cranial swelling has not subsided. I have applied cold compresses and administered a tincture of willow bark. His hands tremble continuously, likely nerve damage from the impact. He grips my wrist in his sleep, as though afraid of falling. He is younger than I first estimated, perhaps 23. And then, 12 pages later, an entry that was longer than all the others. Her father's handwriting was less steady here. The letters pressed harder into the page, as though he had been writing by candlelight with tired hands. Sterling has recovered enough to sit upright and take broth. He will survive, though the tremors may be permanent and the memory loss could worsen with age. I have written a full account of his injuries and treatment for the regimental record. I have also written a separate letter, which I have sealed and placed inside this journal. If I do not return from this campaign, I ask that the letter be delivered to whomever holds authority over the Sterling estate. My next generation, Adelaide and Julian, are young and will have no patron if I fall. I am asking this man's family to remember that I kept him alive when every other surgeon in the camp had given him up. I am asking them to watch over mine. Adelaide closed the journal. She pressed it against her chest and stared at the arched window, where the afternoon light was turning from white to gold. Her father had saved Christopher Sterling's life. He had spent days in a frozen tent, nursing a broken lieutenant back from the edge of death, and in return he had asked for only one thing, that if the worst happened, someone would look after his children. The worst had happened. Captain Louis Vance had died 4 weeks later, finished by a fever that swept through the camp. The journal and its sealed letter had somehow found their way to Christopher Sterling, who had kept them locked in a safe for 8 years, waiting. And when a woman with her father's jaw and her father's eyes had walked down the aisle of a London auction hall and asked him to marry her, he had looked at her face and said the only thing he could say, "Your father's debt is paid." Adelaide pressed her palm flat against the journal's blood-stained cover, and for the first time since she was 16 years old, she wept. Adelaide dried her eyes, returned the journal to the safe, and locked the archive tower behind her. She did not mention what she had found to anyone. There would be time for that conversation later, the conversation where she would sit across from Christopher Sterling and tell him that she understood, that she knew why he had said yes, that the debt between their families was older and deeper than money. That conversation could wait. The poison could not. Adelaide spent the next 5 days preparing. She worked at night, after the house had gone quiet and Mrs. Calloway had retired to her rooms on the ground floor. She returned to the cellar still room each evening and repeated her tests on every bottle Dr. Hallowell had left behind, documenting each result in a small notebook with the same methodical precision her father had used in his field journal. She recorded the dates of Hallowell's visits, the quantities of tonic prescribed, and the observable changes in Christopher's condition following each dose. She cross-referenced these with Lord Montgomery's correspondence. Every letter, every legal inquiry, every carefully worded suggestion that Christopher's mental state was deteriorating beyond recovery. The pattern was undeniable. Each time Montgomery wrote to the family solicitor raising concerns about Christopher's fitness, it followed within days of a visit from Hallowell. The physician would increase the dosage. Christopher would worsen. Montgomery would write another letter. The circle tightened like a noose drawn 1 inch at a time, so gradually that no one inside the house had noticed. Adelaide also did something she had not planned to do. She stopped the poison. She could not simply remove the bottles. Hallowell would notice on his next visit, and confronting him prematurely would alert Montgomery before Adelaide had assembled her full case. Instead, she emptied each tonic bottle carefully, replaced the nightshade-laced compound with a harmless mixture of valerian water and honey, tinted with beetroot to match the original color, and sealed them again. The taste would be different, but Christopher had been taking the medicine for over a year. He swallowed it the way all patients swallow unpleasant things, quickly, without savoring, followed by a glass of water. Within 4 days, the change was remarkable. Christopher's hands still trembled, but the violent seizing episode stopped. His memory sharpened. He began finishing his sentences again, began recognizing which paintings hung on which walls, began eating full meals instead of picking at bread and broth. On the morning of the 32nd day, Adelaide found him standing at the front door of the manor, looking out at the grounds with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Clarity. "The garden has gone to ruin," he said, almost to himself. "I could have sworn I had it maintained." "You did," Adelaide said carefully. 2 years ago, the gardener was dismissed when the household funds were redirected. Christopher frowned. Redirected by whom? Adelaide opened her mouth to answer, but the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive cut her short. A glossy black landau pulled by 4 matched greys came through the gate and stopped before the front steps. The door opened and Lord Montgomery stepped out. He was a man built for drawing rooms, tall, narrow-shouldered, dressed in a dove-gray morning coat with a lavender cravat pinned by a pearl. His face was long and angular, with thin lips and pale blue eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything they touched. Behind him came 2 men in dark suits carrying leather document cases, and behind them, Dr. Hallowell, clutching his medical bag like a shield. "Christopher," Montgomery said warmly, ascending the steps with his hand extended. "You look dreadful, cousin. I came as soon as I could." Christopher did not take his hand. Adelaide noticed that Montgomery's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before resettling itself. "I did not send for you," Christopher said. "No, you did not. But Dr. Hallowell has written to me with considerable concern about your condition, and I felt it was my duty as your nearest relative to act." Montgomery gestured to the 2 men behind him. "This is Mr. Poole and Mr. Ashford, both licensed barristers with the Court of Chancery. They have prepared a declaration." Montgomery reached into his coat, withdrew a folded document, and held it up between 2 fingers. The same gesture, Adelaide noticed with a chill, that Christopher had used when he offered her his calling card at the auction. Family habits. Shared mannerisms. A cousin who had studied his relative closely enough to mirror him. A declaration of incapacity, Montgomery continued smoothly, signed by Dr. Hallowell, supported by 14 months of medical records, and ready to be filed with the court. It names me as your legal guardian and grants me full authority over the Sterling estate, including all harbor assets, shipping licenses, and land holdings. The 2 barristers shifted their weight uncomfortably. Dr. Hallowell stared at the ground. Christopher said nothing. His jaw tightened, and Adelaide saw his right hand begin to tremble. The old tremor, the real one, born from shrapnel and cold, and a collapsed gun carriage on a frozen battlefield. His left hand curled into a fist at his side. Adelaide stepped forward. "Gentlemen," she said, "before you file anything, I would like to present some evidence of my own." She held up her notebook. Small, plain, filled with 5 nights of careful documentation. She opened it to the first page and began to read. She read the chemical composition of each tonic Dr. Hallowell had prescribed. She read the concentrations of belladonna extract she had isolated in the cellar stillroom. She read the dates and dosages, the corresponding entries in Montgomery's letters, and the clinical symptoms of sustained nightshade poisoning matched against her father's medical reference texts. The 2 barristers listened without moving. Dr. Hallowell's face turned the color of old parchment. Adelaide then produced the 5 tonic bottles she had preserved as evidence, each one labeled and sealed with wax, and set them in a row on the stone balustrade of the front steps. "These contain the original compounds," she said. "I replaced the contents of the active bottles 6 days ago with a harmless substitute. Since then, His Grace's condition has improved so dramatically that he is standing here today asking why his garden has not been maintained." She looked directly at Dr. Hallowell. "Would you care to explain that recovery to your colleagues from the Court of Chancery?" Hallowell opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. Montgomery's composure cracked. The smooth, practiced exterior split down the middle like a mask made of porcelain, and beneath it, Adelaide saw something raw and furious and deeply frightened. He looked at the barristers. The barristers looked at the bottles. Nobody moved. "I believe," Adelaide said quietly, "that the magistrate will be very interested in these samples, and in Dr. Hallowell's prescription records, and in your correspondence, Lord Montgomery, which I have copied in full." Montgomery turned on his heel without a word, descended the steps, and climbed back into his landau. Dr. Hallowell followed, stumbling on the bottom step. The barristers remained standing on the front porch, their document cases hanging at their sides, their declaration unsigned. Christopher Sterling stood in his own doorway, clear-eyed for the first time in over a year, and watched his cousin's carriage disappear down the gravel drive. Then he looked at Adelaide. "How long have you known?" he asked. 12 days, she said. He nodded slowly. The tremor in his right hand had stopped. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in a way that the word had never been meant before in that house. The poison left Christopher's body slowly, like fog lifting from a valley. In the week following Montgomery's departure, Adelaide watched the change unfold in small, steady increments. He stopped losing the thread of conversations. He remembered what he had eaten for breakfast. He walked the cliff path in the evenings with longer strides and a straighter back, and once she saw him standing at the study window, reading a harbor report without the magnifying glass. His hands still shook. They would always shake. That was the war's mark, permanent and honest, carved into his nerves by shrapnel and frost. But the fog was gone. The glassy confusion that had haunted his eyes for 14 months had burned away, and what remained was sharp and steady and quietly angry. On the 38th evening, Christopher summoned Adelaide to the study. He was standing behind his desk when she entered, and spread across the desk's surface was a large maritime chart of the Portsmouth coastline. Every dock, every warehouse, every freight canal and loading quay marked in fine ink. Beside the chart lay Adelaide's notebook, open to the pages where she had documented Malmesbury's connection to the Harbour Guild. "Tell me everything," he said. Adelaide told him. She told him about the Guildhall, about Malmesbury's oiled smile and his gold watch chain, about the deed Julian had signed and the harbour-front land beneath her father's workshop. She told him about the 3 riders on the Old Post Road and Malmesbury's message to stay away from the registries. She told him what she had suspected since that day at the Guildhall, but had not yet been able to prove, that Malmesbury's interest in the workshop land was connected to something larger than commercial redevelopment. The freight canal behind the workshop connects directly to the deep water anchorage at the south end of the harbour, Adelaide said, tracing the route on the chart with her finger. A vessel could enter the anchorage at night, offload cargo into the canal, and move it through the workshop yard without ever passing through the customs inspection at the main dock. If Malmesbury controls that land, he controls an unmonitored passage from the open sea to the interior freight network. "Smuggling," Christopher said, "on an industrial scale, and protected by the Harbour Guild, whose senior clerk is already on his payroll." Christopher studied the chart. His jaw worked slowly, the way it did when he was thinking, a habit Adelaide had learned to recognize over the past weeks, one of the many small details of his character that had emerged as the poison receded and the real man underneath began to surface. "Malmesbury's operation depends on 2 things," Christopher said, The land and the vessels. If we remove both, the route collapses. He straightened up. I still hold the naval authority over Portsmouth Harbor. It was granted by the Admiralty after my last commission and has never been revoked. I can order an inspection of any vessel within harbor limits and seize any cargo that lacks proper customs documentation. You would need evidence that the cargo exists, Adelaide said. Malmesbury is careful. He would not leave contraband sitting in a warehouse during daylight hours. Then we go at night. Adelaide looked at him. The oil lamp cast deep shadows across his scarred face, and his gray eyes held a steadiness she had not seen since the day he had ridden out to the cliffs to find her. This was the man her father had saved on a frozen battlefield. The officer, the commander, the lieutenant who had survived a collapsed gun carriage and crawled back toward the living. I will need Julian, Adelaide said. Why? Because Julian spent 3 months inside Malmesbury's operation. He sat in the back rooms. He saw the men, the ledgers, the systems. He knows where Malmesbury keeps his records, and more importantly, he knows which of Malmesbury's associates can be compelled to cooperate. Julian made terrible decisions, but he has a sharp memory, and he owes this family a debt far larger than money. Christopher considered this for a moment, then nodded. Julian, when told of the plan, went pale. Then he straightened his shoulders, set his jaw in a way that reminded Adelaide painfully of their father, and said, "Tell me what you need." They moved on the 40th night. Christopher had spent 2 days coordinating with the local magistrate, a cautious, methodical man named Harding, who had long suspected irregular activity at the South Docks, but had lacked the authority to act against Malmesbury's guild connections. Christopher's naval commission provided that authority. At 11:30, a column of magistrates' guards assembled at the north gate of the harbor, armed with lanterns and writs of inspection. Christopher led them on foot through the dockyard. Adelaide walked beside him. Julian walked ahead, guiding them through the maze of warehouses and loading bays toward a large stone building at the water's edge, Malmesbury's private storage facility, built directly over the freight canal entrance. The warehouse was locked. Christopher presented the writ. The magistrate's men broke the chain. Inside, they found exactly what Adelaide had predicted. Crates of untaxed French brandy, stacked floor to ceiling. Bolts of silk bearing no customs stamps. Barrels of tobacco marked with forged excise seals. And in a small office at the back of the building, behind a false wall panel that Julian identified without hesitation, a set of leather-bound ledger books recording every shipment, every payment, every bribe paid to harbor officials and guild clerks over the previous 3 years. Julian carried the ledgers out himself. He placed them in the magistrate's hands and stood back, his face drawn and tired, and for the first time since Adelaide had arrived at Stirling Manor, he looked like a man who understood the weight of what he had done and was willing to carry it. Christopher ordered the seizure of 4 vessels moored at the South Anchorage, all registered under false names, all carrying cargo without documentation. His naval authority was absolute within harbor limits, and the captains surrendered without resistance. By dawn, Malmesbury's operation was gutted. His vessels were impounded, his warehouses sealed, his ledgers in the hands of the court. The smuggling route through the freight canal was closed permanently. The deed to Adelaide's workshop was found inside the false wall, filed alongside dozens of other property documents Malmesbury had extracted from desperate borrowers over the years. The magistrate returned it to Adelaide on the dock, still folded, still bearing Julian's careless signature. Adelaide held it in both hands. The harbor was quiet now, the torches guttering in the pre-dawn wind, the gray water of the channel slowly brightening toward morning. Christopher stood beside her, his scarred face calm, his hands resting at his sides. The right one trembled faintly. He did not hide it. "Your father's workshop," he said. Adelaide looked down at the deed, then out at the harbor, where her father's 3 small barks rocked gently at their moorings, and felt something settle inside her chest, something that had been unsettled for a very long time. "Our workshop," she said. 10 days passed. The magistrate's court processed Malmesbury's case with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested half of Portsmouth had been waiting years for someone to finally act. The smuggling ledgers provided enough evidence to dismantle the entire syndicate. 14 men arrested, 6 vessels permanently impounded, and Malmesbury himself stripped of his trading license and barred from operating within 50 miles of any English port. He left Portsmouth in a hired coach on a Tuesday morning, carrying a single trunk, and no one came to see him off. Lord Montgomery's situation unraveled more slowly. The 2 barristers from the Court of Chancery had returned to London with Adelaide's evidence: the preserved tonic bottles, her chemical analysis, and copies of Montgomery's correspondence. Dr. Hallowell, faced with the prospect of criminal prosecution for administering poison under the guise of medical treatment, provided a full written confession within 48 hours. He named Montgomery as the architect of the scheme and detailed every instruction he had received over 14 months. Montgomery was stripped of his access to the Sterling Family Trust and placed under formal investigation. His name, which had once carried weight in certain London circles, became the kind of name that people mentioned only in whispers and only when they were certain he was not in the room. Sterling Manor changed. Adelaide opened the curtains first. Every window in the house, starting with the ground floor and working her way up over the course of 3 mornings, until the rooms that had been sealed in permanent twilight for years were suddenly flooded with coastal light. The dust cloths came off the parlor furniture. The front garden was cleared and replanted. Mrs. Calloway knew a retired groundsman in the village who arrived with his own tools and a terrier that immediately took up residence beneath the kitchen table. The west corridor, which Adelaide had once been forbidden from entering, was aired out, scrubbed down, and converted into a proper estate office with a wide desk, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the sea. Christopher worked at that desk every morning now. His handwriting was still uneven, the tremor saw to that, but the words themselves were clear and purposeful. He wrote letters to the Admiralty confirming the harbor seizures. He reviewed shipping contracts that had been neglected for years. He signed documents with a hand that shook and a mind that did not. Julian left Sterling Manor on the 45th day. He had secured a junior clerk's position with a reputable shipping firm in Bristol, a post arranged through one of Christopher's naval contacts, offered on the condition that Julian would start at the bottom and work his way up like any ordinary man. Julian had accepted without argument. On the morning of his departure, he stood in the gravel drive with a canvas bag over his shoulder and his hat in his hands, looking at his sister with an expression that held equal parts gratitude and shame. "I will pay back every penny," he said. "I know you will," Adelaide replied. Julian turned to Christopher, who stood on the front steps with his arms folded. The 2 men regarded each other for a long moment, the reckless younger brother and the scarred duke who had paid his debts without ever being asked. "Thank you, Your Grace," Julian said, "for everything." Christopher gave a single nod. "Write to your sister, she worries." Julian smiled, a real smile, the first one Adelaide had seen from him in months, and climbed into the waiting coach. Adelaide watched it disappear down the lane, through the gate, and out onto the coast road, until it was nothing more than a dark speck against the chalk hills. On the 50th day, Christopher asked Adelaide to walk with him. They took the cliff path, the one he had walked alone every evening since she had arrived, the narrow track that wound along the bluff above the channel, where the wind was constant, and the sea stretched out to the horizon like hammered silver. The sun was low, turning the sky from pale blue to amber, and the gulls wheeled overhead in wide, lazy circles. Christopher carried a leather folio under his arm. He walked in silence for several minutes, his boots crunching on the chalky ground, his face turned toward the water. Adelaide walked beside him and waited. They stopped at the overlook, a flat ledge of stone at the highest point of the cliff, where the entire coastline was visible from the harbor mouth to the distant gray smudge of the Isle of Wight. Below them, the sea broke against the rocks in long, rolling waves that sounded like breathing. Christopher opened the folio and held out a document. Adelaide took it. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, stamped with the county registrar's seal. She read the title line and stopped. "A land charter," she said. "A new one, drawn up last week." Christopher stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, the wind pulling at his dark hair. "It combines the sterling coastal holdings with your family's harborfront property, the workshop, the freight yard, and the 3 vessel berths. Under the charter, the combined land is designated as the site for an open merchant academy, navigation, shipbuilding, maritime trade, and carriage engineering. Free enrollment for any qualified applicant, regardless of berth or station." Adelaide read the document again, more slowly this time. The terms were detailed and generous. The academy would be funded by revenue from the sterling shipping contracts. The workshop would serve as the primary training facility. Adelaide was named as the academy's founding director. She looked up at him. "You are giving away half your estate." "I am investing it," Christopher said, "in something your father would have built himself if he had lived long enough." Adelaide held the charter against her chest. The wind off the channel pressed her dress flat against her legs and pulled loose strands of hair across her face. She looked at Christopher Sterling, this man who had carried her father's blood-stained journal in a locked safe for 8 years, who had answered a stranger's desperate proposal with 5 quiet words, who had endured 14 months of poison with the same stubborn, unbending will that had kept him alive on a frozen battlefield when every surgeon, except one, had given up. "Christopher," she said, "why did you never come to find us? You had the journal, you had the letter, you knew our names. 8 years, and you never once sought us out." Christopher was quiet for a long time. The waves broke below. A gull cried somewhere out over the water. "Because your father asked me to watch over his next generation," he said. "He did not ask me to burden them with an obligation. I kept the journal. I kept the promise. I watched from a distance, made sure the estate remained in your family's name, made sure Julian's school fees were covered when your aunt's funds ran short. When you walked into that auction hall, I thought I was seeing a ghost." He paused. "You have your father's eyes, the same look, the same iron." Adelaide felt something shift between them, something that had been building quietly, day by day, through shared meals and late-night ledger work, and a roadside rescue, and a cellar full of poisoned bottles. It was not the contractual alliance they had agreed upon in a crowded bidding hall. It was something that had grown in the space around that contract, filling the gaps the way light fills a room when the curtains are finally drawn. "I would like to change the terms of our arrangement," Adelaide said. Christopher looked at her. "In what way?" "I would like this marriage to be real." The wind blew. The sun touched the horizon line. Christopher Sterling, the Iron Duke, the most feared man on the southern coast, looked at the woman who had saved his mind, his estate, and his life, and for the second time since she had known him, his expression changed. The hard line of his mouth softened, the gray eyes warmed. And something that might, in the right light, from the right angle, be called a smile moved across his scarred face. "It has been real," he said, "since the moment you held me upright on that horse." Adelaide laughed. It surprised her, a short, bright sound that the wind caught and carried out over the cliff edge toward the open sea. She took his hand, the right one, the one that trembled. She held it firmly, the way you hold something precious that is slightly broken and all the more valuable for it. They stood together on the overlook as the sun went down over the English Channel, the new charter pressed between them, the old debt finally and completely paid.